So how do we create change when there's resistance in an organisation? Well, I mean, I'm sure Emma will have plenty to say on this from your experience with the police. But, you know, basically every organisation resists change, right? Because there are established structures of power. People don't like to change, whether they say they do or not. The whole point of liberation is that we're supposed to kind of deconstruct the systems that have created these oppressions or have been designed to create these oppressions. And that inherently involves giving up power from a lot of people who really feel as though they deserve to have it. So, you know, yes, there's going to be resistance in every organisation, no matter how forward-thinking they claim to be. And how forward-claiming you may personally feel you are as well. So there's some really interesting self-reflection as much as organisational reflection. I think, look, there's lots of different approaches with this stuff. Ideally, you have some resource in your organisation which focuses on something around the work of ED&I. I appreciate that corporate ED&I can also be problematic in itself, but at the very least you have a resource that looks towards that. If you don't, that's a slightly different conversation, and that's really about, I think, about building activism within staff teams, getting people together and sharing ideas that we can kind of tackle collectively. Again, so this is why things like staff diversity networks and trade unions are super important. Having this sense of collectivism to create a groundswell and create change is really, really key. So the more you can do that, I think the better. If you do have the ability as an organisation to focus more on this at a strategic level, even if there is resistance, I think the number one thing that people forget to do or think they've done is to really nail the case for change. And we've really tired out the old capitalist business case. I'm so bored of it. The fact that we have to talk about why it makes money when a capitalist system itself is inherently problematic. It's just really not the vibe. So, I mean, you know, some people do need to talk about why it makes profit, and that is what makes your organisation tick. But I would really encourage you to go back and think again about what it is about being an anti-oppressive organisation or an organisation that works to make the world a fairer place that is just good for people and good for the world when we are facing the things that we're facing at the moment, and really try to tap into people's kind of hearts and minds about those kinds of things rather than assuming that we've solved that, because I don't think we have. And obviously there are other things as well, but I'll leave the panel to talk about the rest of that.
Mix things up. Look at this guy. Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. I think, so I think for me, convincing people to get on board is like one of my #1 jobs. It's like the thing I do. It's very exhausting emotional labor. And that's just something to really keep in mind. So if you're going into that space and you're going into that conversation, may I please encourage you to book half an hour afterwards for a nap? Because I'm not kidding, actually take care of yourselves if you're going into that space. It's hard, right? And then I want you to read up on something called reverse canvassing. So this was some research done on fighting transphobia specifically. And what these people did is, we all know what canvassing is, right? People come to your door and then try to convince you to vote a certain way. Reverse canvassing is they come to your door and then you talk. Instead of them talking at you, you talk. So they ask questions. So to be like, what do you think about trans rights, for example? And somebody be like, oh, trans people are all perverts, blah, 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 right? They're gonna tell you some crap. And then you'd be like, okay, great, what are your family values? What do you believe in? What makes a good person? And you just work through, what are their values? What do they believe in? What are their boundaries? What are their experiences of being mistreated? How have they felt in that time? How might trans people feel in that space? How might they make sure that trans people feel loved and accepted and welcomed? What voting policies are then required to ensure that? And they get there on their own by being led these sort of guiding questions. It's called actively processing your values. And a lot of people have to do it themselves. You can't tell people how to think. Nobody likes being told how to think. They have to get there on their own. And that takes a process. It takes a moment. And they need to feel safe to get there. They need to be not yelled at and told off. They need to be able to to go on that journey. So for me, I've been on that journey for a very long time. So growing up queer in a small town, that happens to you. You have to go on that journey, right? But other people don't. Other people don't have to go on that journey, right? But you can create spaces where they feel safe to do so. And so that can be really useful. And then if that's still not working, what I then shift to is being like, fine, you're not on board on trans rights. Okay, you're a transphobe. we're not getting past that. So now what is identifying shared issues? So I talked about housing earlier, right? 25% of trans people have experienced homelessness, right? So that is also true of white working class people, of people with disabilities, of seniors. There's loads of groups who struggle with housing, right? So you don't need to say, oh, you should care about trans people. What you need to say is, oh, you need to access housing. So do all of these other people. Let's work together, right? So when I'm talking to men about feminism, which is exhausting, I will often talk about men's mental health, right? And I will often just be like, right, well, like, you're refusing to be a feminist, which is ridiculous, but fine. Let's talk about the fact that you're disproportionately more likely to die of a heart attack or from suicide, right? And what can we do to mitigate that? Oh, it's fight toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. Great, let's do that, because that will save your life, right? Literally your life. And then I get loads of men on board, like, you know, supporting feminist causes. So, you know, take what wins you can, I guess.
I don't know if I can add to that. I think you both said some really strong things. I think I just want to come back to this point that you made at the beginning around looking after yourself. I've noticed since George Floyd and BLM 3 years ago that it's opened up new opportunity for ED&I folk to then start that consultancy that they've always wanted to start, or to go out and do the work, because there's so much more demand now for ED&I, particularly anti-racism. As a consequence of that, those people are now severely suffering from burnout and fatigue, closing down those consultancies or leaving their in-house roles and going elsewhere. Because it's tough, it's hard. Self-care for a lot of people looks different. It could be going for a run, it could be going to the gym, it could be going to a spa, whatever. But for me personally, self-care is messy, it can be ugly, and it's difficult. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you are stepping into this space properly, professionally, look after yourself. Can you really do it based on your own lived experience and that's it? Can you really just rely on that? Or do you have the strategic mindset to do both? Use your lived experience to make change, but also gain and use your experience and your expertise from other areas, or your transferable skills to engage people, because this isn't easy, and I don't think lived experience alone is enough. So I would urge everybody that is going into this space to have done the work on yourself, look after yourself, make sure that you're healing from past traumas, and because it can be really dangerous to use your past traumas to fuel the work that you're doing if those traumas haven't necessarily been healed, because you could be re-traumatizing yourself. Influencing people isn't easy, and have I got time to share an example of when I've influenced someone, but it was at the expense of my own mental health? I was a D&I manager in an organisation, and it started off really well. All the right things were said. They wanted to make change, and they wanted someone to come in and kickstart their strategy. So I did. I went in, and I thought I had buy-in from the very top. As the months went on, it became clear to me that there were a few blockers in the organisation at the top. So it was very difficult for me to take them on an anti-racism journey when that is what they needed to go on. And I think they were focused on me working on external programmes rather than working on the internal stuff that they needed to focus on. So I started there. Get our own house in order, and then we can move on to the outside. And as the months went on, it became more and more difficult. I was subject to microaggressions. There was a lot of pushback. There were a lot of really challenging questions from people that I thought I had support from. When it came to sharing the strategy, the draft strategy, to some trustees, I was met with some hostility, some tension. They couldn't really understand why we were being anti-racist. Wasn't it enough that they were non-racist? And that there were a lot of problematic power dynamics at play. And I came off that call, I shut the laptop, and I burst into tears because I wasn't expecting what I was met with. The following day, I was on a call with one of the trustees that was on that call, and they didn't introduce me to somebody else that we were on the call with. It was a member of parliament, actually, and we were talking about how we could make our programmes more inclusive. And he ignored me, but introduced the sort of head of comms at the time. So again, another microaggression that I had to deal with after coming off that call the following day. Then I decided it was time to leave. In the middle of all this, the chair of the board emailed myself, all of the other trustees, following that trustees call, and said that, maybe their understanding wasn't what it could have been, and maybe they needed to go away and reflect. I then responded to that email and reached out privately and said, shall we meet for coffee and have a conversation about the call? Because I think we just need to meet. So we met, we had a 2-hour conversation, and we talked about everything from racism to my experiences in the police and his experiences growing up. And I believe he's in his 70s, so he's lived a very interesting life. And we connected, and he looked at me and said, who hired you? And I told him, and he went, interesting. Okay. I don't know what that meant. After the meeting, I felt really good about it. I felt really positive. I felt like he had sort of gone on a bit of a journey. He then emailed everybody, the trustees, the people that were on that call, and myself, and said that after meeting with Emma, I myself have gone on a journey, and I'm now reading Michael Holding's book, Why We Kneel, How We Rise. Michael Holding was a black cricketer, and he wrote a book on racism in cricket. And the chair of the board has read this book and is now going on a bit of a journey himself to understanding what it means to be anti-racist and why the organisation should be anti-racist. So what turned out to be quite a difficult experience for me turned into something quite positive, ultimately, and my outcome was achieved. The organisation are now going on this journey, but at the expense of my own mental health and kind of, experience. And I ended up leaving that organisation because of that. But, I think that you can influence in lots of different ways, and there are so many ways to do it. But sometimes it's not always effective on yourself if you're the one that's coming out of it, in a sort of emotional state. So for me, just look after yourself and make sure that, if you are going into this space, get paid for it. Don't do things for free. If your lived experience isn't to be used and shared in a way that educates others, but then leaves you feeling traumatized afterwards. So make sure that you look after yourself and go into this for the right reasons, I think.
Thank you. I think it's really important and really impactful, kind of story there, message there. It's so important to look after yourself, and also to find your allies and check in on each other and look after each other as well. And I really like the point you made about going back to how do you convince people to come along. It's that what I always call the inception moment, is you have to make them think it's their idea, and then it's like, oh, of course we're doing that. It's my idea.